I love that it tells you now. All right, so, well, I want to welcome everybody to our Nature 101 series. So these are going to be recorded and they will be on the Zionsville Parks and Recreation YouTube channel for you to always go back and view them at another time or share them with friends and family that couldn't participate. But we started Nature 101 this year as a way to kind of bridge, I guess, different natural history topics. So we've got several that are already on YouTube for you to go back through. And of course, the year is not over. So if you like this one, you can always check out for the next August is actually on watersheds of all things. But I am going to stop talking because I am no way any sort of expert when it comes to Lepidoptera. And I'm going to turn it over to Amanda Smith and Steve Sass. I'll let them introduce themselves and let them get started.
Thanks, Mindy.
So I go to the share screen here. See if we can get this to work correctly. Let me know if you have it. Do you have it?
Yes.
Okay. So it's probably, we have a slight delay we've noticed when we do these screen shares via Zoom. So sometimes I get to talking and I'll advance the screen and start talking about the next slide. The next slide hasn't started yet. So, so anyway, welcome to our program, which is really about the moths of Indiana, or we can call it Mothing 101. That definitely works. We're going to kind of cover some of the basics of what they are and how interesting they are, which is unknown to many people. And let's see if we can figure this out. Okay, a little bit about us. That's me coming up hopefully on the left side of your screen. My name's Steve. I live just outside of South Bend, and I'm self-employed as an electronics contractor. But in my spare time, I've been involved with a lot of different environmental organizations throughout the years, and currently I have a role with the city of South Bend as the Ecological Advocacy Committee Chair, and I've served on various Audubon societies, native plant societies, etc. That's actually how I met Amanda, was through a native plant society about 5.5 years ago. We realized that we had some mutual interests on this very subject that we're talking about tonight.
And I'm Amanda Smith, and I work for Hamilton County Parks Department for Hamilton County, but primarily Cool Creek Nature Center is where my office is out of, in the Carmel Westfield area. And I've been involved in several organizations related to plants and wildlife and all kinds of things. So, and I've more recently taken an interest in moths in regards to trying to learn more about them. We're going to start off tonight with our project. Sometimes we end with this, but we wanted to kind of preference everything that we're talking about. Our love of diversity and moths and what moths eat and the native plants that sustain them, and then the birds and everything else that eat the moths, just the whole food web. We started a web page through our web page, indiananature.net, all about kind of focusing in on Lepidoptera. Lepidoptera in this case, which we'll explain, but it does include moths and butterflies. So we're going to focus tonight on moths, which doesn't get near as much press, but we started a program that actually is trying to track some of these moth and butterfly populations. And then the plan is to provide a web page for each species and even up in their taxonomy into higher taxonomy to look at how they're alike and similar and how they're grouped. So this is one of our kind of index page or starter page for the Lepidoptera project, which we call the Great American Indiana Nature Lepidoptera Project. It's one of a few different projects that we have going on. So this is GAINLP. There are a lot of different features to our webpage, and Steve has a master at this side of building these web pages and making hopefully it more educational and user friendly for people to try to really as a resource to dive into the moths of Indiana that we found so far. So this is an example for kind of the more popular, one of the more popular groups. Actually, this is just more or less kind of where we are now in our webpage with the different families and super families of moths that we have thus far made pages for.
This is sort of like a clickable field guide. Think of it that way. Like if you break out your field guide, like I've got the butterflies of Indiana here, and typically, you go to a page and there might be a page of silhouettes or something in the book. And so with what we did with the website is each one of these photos actually, if you click on it, it will take you to that particular taxa page. So it's kind of an interesting way of utilizing the internet and technology to make kind of a modern field guide out of it.
So if you were to click on one of those colored squares, I think the mauve colored square for this group, you would get onto a page that then groups them by family. And this happens to be a family of moths that are very popular. And so then you could kind of drill down from there. If you wanted to look just at the Luna moth, you could keep clicking down to learn more about that. But this also gives you some idea of why they're grouped together. And then this is an example of one of our species pages. So in this case, we're looking at the Polyphemus moth, which is a very large moth here in Indiana. And you can learn all about it on this page, including how to pronounce its scientific name and its distribution across North America, as well as its conservation status, pictures on different angles and hind wings and forewings and underwings and things. And then where in Indiana this has been identified or found and then reported through the GAINLP program. So these are specifically people who have, for the most part, submitted their sightings of the Polyphemus moth through our Facebook group. And then we can add those to the page and then add that county on there. And then one of the more exciting things that I think really has driven Steve and I into this is the connections that the moths have to the rest of the ecosystem. So in this case, we make sure that we include a list of plants that the larvae eat. And so you really can't have a beautiful moth or butterfly unless you feed them as caterpillars. And so it will provide a list of all the different tree species. In this case, Polyphemus eats a lot of things. So a lot of different plants that they will feed on as larvae. I'll let you take that one.
Okay, so this is some more data that we have on the species pages. It's all stored. It's really pretty cool how we do this. So if you can imagine how this works, a person goes outside, maybe looks at their lamp post or the light on the side of their house, and they see a moth. They can take a photo of it with their cell phone camera, send it to us. We enter the photo and the information, the sighting, into the database that we maintain. And then from the database, we're able to output some different information. So the graph that you see here are the sightings by month. I think this is still the Polyphemus moth, right?
Yes, it is.
So you can see like when the adults emerge and when people are seeing caterpillars. And then the graph on the top right is showing sightings by year. 2018 was down because that was the year we started this project and we didn't really ramp it up until halfway through the summer. But for whatever reason, if you look at 2020, there was a steep drop in the sightings of Polyphemus moths, and I guess we really haven't determined why that is, but it's useful information, I think, to be able to track long-term trends. And then the bottom graph shows the sightings by gender. In this case, we're seeing predominantly male moths because they're the ones that are out seeking the females. And this is another one of another sample of the species page. So the sightings that folks submit to us go into a table, and we also assign these phenophase codes to them. And essentially what this is it's the life cycle stage that we're seeing of these various insects. So if we see a caterpillar, it's listed under the code for caterpillar. If we see two adults mating, that gets a certain code. So that enables us to track and do more graphing and studying of what we're finding with these various moths. And let's see, we have a YouTube video that is on, I think the only video that's currently on our relatively new YouTube channel that kind of walks you through these web pages in much more detail than what we're doing here. So, but the question and then becomes, why moths? Why did we start working on these? What's interesting about them?
A lot of people wonder why we've gotten into moths and spend so much time on them. The common misperceptions or conceptions about moths are that they're all small, they're pretty boring looking, they're only seen at night, and they eat their clothes. This is true for some moths, but actually majority of them, it's not true. This particular moth that we've chosen as an example on this slide actually does fit some of these. It is called the drab prominent. So it's not the most exciting of all moths. It does come out at night. It doesn't eat your clothes. It's not actually small at all. It's probably about the size of a $50. And I guess some would call it boring, but it's actually a pretty cool moth. It provides an example to the next moth, which does not fit those kind of criteria. So this is the rosy maple moth. This is an actual moth that lives here in Indiana. And it looks like a cartoon character. It's pink and yellow. In fact, these photos don't always even give it justice. And it's a gorgeous moth. So not all moths are, and actually neither of these moths, I should mention, eat clothing. That's actually a specific kind of moth that only occurs, it actually has been introduced into Indiana.
So the moths and butterflies belong to a class of insects known as Lepidoptera. And on this graphic, we have some other of the classes of insects, order of Lepidoptera. Insect itself is the class, and then below class is broken down into order. So Lepidoptera is one order, but there are many other orders that you are no doubt familiar with, such as all of the flies are contained in the order of Diptera, or all of the beetles are contained in the order of Coleoptera, which is actually the largest order of animals in the animal kingdom. So we're focusing in on the Lepidoptera, the butterflies and the moths, a little bit about insect physiology. All insects have the same basic body parts. So there are three body parts to them: the head, the thorax in the middle, and then the abdomen, which is at the back end. All insects also have three pairs of legs, and they have one pair of antennae. So this is common of everything in the class of Insecta. And Lepidoptera are no exception to that, although they look a little bit different than the beetle in the prior photo. This is a moth called the common pug, and you can clearly see the three body parts: the head at the front, the abdomen at the back, and then the thorax in the middle, which is where the wings are attaching. And when we get into insect identification or moth identification, we can get into really looking at the specific body parts. The abdominal segments all have names to them. The veins on the wings all have names to them. So the order of Lepidoptera itself has an interesting origin, or the name does. I'll let Amanda talk about that.
Yeah, so our Lepidoptera, it's fun when you start learning some of these scientific names, even in medicine and things, but a lot of them are based on Greek and Latin, and this is similar. So, and you can find out some cool history when you start looking at some of those scientific names. But Lepidoptera essentially is a combination word from a Greek word lepis, that means scales, and pteron means wings. So they have scaly wings. And this photo that you see on the side is actually a microscopic look at a specific type of, I think in this case, a butterfly. But you can see how those scales overlap each other like the shingles of a roof. If you've ever touched the wing of a butterfly or moth, you may have felt your fingers are powdery. Those are actually sort of the pressure of our fingers crushing those tiny little scales, that's why we don't want to handle butterflies and moths too much, because they need those for protection. There are a handful. In fact, if you see a moth or butterfly that's pretty old, kind of worn, sometimes those scales have fallen off, and the wing will be transparent. So if the scales weren't there, it would actually be see-through.
So the order of Lepidoptera itself is further broken down into superfamilies. That's the next division below order. And in this graphic, we see up there on the top right-hand side, the Papilionoidea, again, my tongue twister, which are the butterflies and the skippers. Those all represent one superfamily within the order of Lepidoptera. And so to put things into perspective, think of all of the butterflies and skippers, which are very closely related to butterflies. You would recognize those immediately if we showed you a picture. They typically are like little butterflies that sit with their back wings out and their forewings up. Anyway, those represent every butterfly in the world is in this one superfamily of Lepidoptera. And now contrast that to this, which is all of the superfamilies of moths that are within the order of Lepidoptera. So there are over 40 different superfamilies of moths to the one superfamily of butterflies. And it's estimated that worldwide there are about 10 species of moths for every one species of butterfly. So there are a lot of moths out there, most of which are going unnoticed by most people. Moths typically are nocturnal, so they're flying at night. Not all of them, but most of them are. Whereas butterflies and skippers are almost entirely diurnal. There's only one family of butterflies in the world that's not diurnal. Diurnal meaning that they're day flyers. So in addition to that, we have some other subtle differences in how you can tell the difference whether an organism is a butterfly, a moth, or a skipper. The butterflies typically have large wings and smaller bodies, versus the moths and the skippers typically have larger bodies than butterflies do to their wing proportions. And then the antennae. So butterfly have little clubs. Butterflies and skippers both have these little club-shaped appendages at the end of the antennae. All butterflies and skippers have clubs, and no moths do. So moths have different forms of antennae, which we'll show you shortly. But if you're unsure whether or not an organism is a butterfly or a moth, you can look at the antennae if you can get close enough, and that'll give you a surefire indication. So the physiology itself on the moth, this is a really neat moth on this next slide, the sweetheart underwing. And the reason why they have the common name of underwing is that you can see from the photograph that the rear wings are quite colorful, versus the forewings are quite drab, and there's an adaptation for that, which we'll talk a little bit about. So there's our hind wings and our forewings. And then this is another moth in the geometer moth or geometridae family called the large lace border moth. And it looks like that this moth maybe only has 2 wings, but if you look closely, there are 4 wings. All butterflies and moths have fore and aft wings, or fore and hind wings. And then there's different names for the various parts of the wings. The tip of the forewing is called the appendix. The front edge of the forewing is called the costal margin. The back edges are called the outer margins, and so on and so forth. And these aren't things that most people have to start off knowing, but when you get into identification with field guides, a lot of times they'll reference some of these areas, as well as the actual lines themselves. So there are, if you ever look at a moth like this one, it has several different lines that are running across its wings, and they all have names. So the one in the middle is called the median line. If there's a line in front of that, it's called the antemedial line. If there is a line behind that, it's called the postmedial line. Then the one that's behind the postmedial line is called the terminal line. And then if there's another line in between the postmedial and the terminal line, we call it the subterminal line. And then the area below the terminal line is called the fringe. So lots of different terminology that goes into it. But again, you know, when you're starting out learning these things, these aren't the first things that you need to know. But you know, when you're going into field guides and you're trying to separate a couple of different species that look a lot like each other, they'll utilize these terms. Discal spots on the wings of moths can be another way for identification. And sometimes if the spots are kidney shaped, they're called reniform spots. This is another one of those underwings, the widow underwing, which incidentally, the underwings are all named, they all have a woman connotation to them. Like the last one was the sweetheart. This is the widow. There's a bunch of different really interesting and colorful names that go into this. And then wing venation is another thing that entomologists will sometimes use to be able to identify insects. So for example, in this particular slide, the graphic on the right, which we drew in-house, these are a couple of our some of our fairly well-known diurnal moths called the hummingbird moths. There's two of them, the snowberry clearwing and the hummingbird clearwing. And if you look at the top of that drawing, you'll see the complete discal cell on the snowberry clearwing versus the bisected discal cell on the hummingbird clearwing. So sometimes these venations can come into play. And we talked about the antennae being never clubbed on moths, but being different types of antennae. And so this graph or this slide represents a few different forms of the antennae. So some moths have like a thread-like antennae, like the one in the middle, and we call that one a filiform antennae. And sometimes they have these combed edges on them, like the one in the bottom left. And when they're like that, we call them pectinate. And sometimes they're combed on two sides, and we call those bipectinate. And some moths have combs on four sides, and those are called quadripectinate antennae. And Amanda, I'll turn it over to you for this one.
So moths are part of all ecosystems. So we're going to run through a few examples of that. And they are a big part of just everything, really. So they are pollinators. Not all moths pollinate, but there is a large group that do. So several of the moths in this photo or a collection of photos are part of the Sphinx moths, and they are pollinators. The one in the middle is one that a lot of us are seeing now as caterpillars and kind of think of more as pesky, but this is the tobacco hornworm, which eats tomato plants. It's a native insect though, and so if left to live and maybe allow them to eat a handful of tomato plants, we'll have a beautiful pollinator. It actually has the longest tongue or proboscis of any moth, I think in our area at least. So pollinators. And then one of the more important things that moths also do is they are bird food. So it's okay, there we go. So they are food for a lot of different animals, but in particular birds. So and this is most true in the caterpillar phase. And this is true for butterflies and other, any insect really that has a larval or even grub stage, which most do, are going to be eaten by a variety of different predators. But birds in particular, caterpillars are sort of perfectly formed little things to just stuff into the mouths of baby birds. So you can see here the chickadee actually, which is on the bottom left-hand corner. This is a common bird. It comes to bird feeders. Of course, right now we're not feeding birds, but it will come to bird food and eat the seed. But actually that seed is not what it's feeding its babies. These birds, including cardinals and others, are feeding its babies caterpillars, in particular, insects of some sort, and almost exclusively insects. So they also eat insects, but the babies have to have a protein meal, and so they have to actually eat those insects. That one entomologist, Dr. Doug Talame, concluded that a nest of chickadee needs about 7,500 caterpillars in order for those chickadees to be kind of fed enough to fledge the nest. So they need 7,500 caterpillars for a clutch of eggs, which is just amazing. But they are a major source of food and very important for frogs and toads and all kinds of different things. One quick example, there's a bird that actually overwinters in Indiana called the golden crown kinglet. This is any bird watcher in the group may look for this in the winter. It's the smallest bird to survive Indiana winters. It's only about 2 pennies in size, and it doesn't come to bird feeders through the winter. So scientists wanted to figure out what it was eating. How did it survive our winters if it wasn't eating seed? So after some studies on a few of the birds, they concluded that in the stomachs and also the crops, kind of the secondary holding tank that birds have, they found one particular insect, and it was the insect of a caterpillar form of an insect called the one-spotted variant. And this is a very common moth. It's one of the most common moths that are reported in the GAINLP. It's small, but it overwinters as a caterpillar. And this is primarily what's feeding, in this case, the golden crown kinglet. Go for it.
Well, I had to do this slide. This is
yeah.
This is Amanda's picture, but I had
that's true.
The last time I presented this program, I had to talk about it, and it wasn't nearly as effective because her story is way better about this one. So, but I'll just start off by saying that since caterpillars, butterfly and moth caterpillars are so important to birds, and they're so necessary for bird reproduction. How is it that they're able to survive when we're talking about a chickadee having to have 7,500 caterpillars to raise a clutch of eggs? And the answer is that they have evolved some pretty amazing and tremendous defenses. So if you don't have a strategy for defense, you're not going to last very long on planet Earth, because there's a lot of things that are out that are looking to eat these little caterpillars. And so this caterpillar in this photo, or this organism in this photo, is a caterpillar, and I'll let Amanda take it from there to talk more about this one.
This is the saddleback caterpillar. This is actually a medically significant caterpillar. Those little spines can cause a lot of problems. But if you can imagine for a second that you're a bird and you're kind of popping along a little shrub and you come across this, we're actually looking at the tail end of the caterpillar, so kind of the rear end. And it has these glowing eyes. So we're going to talk a lot about how caterpillars and moths use eye spots sometimes. And I'm looking at this photo of the rear end of this caterpillar, and I realized if you've ever watched the old Ghostbusters, I didn't see the new one, so I don't know if it's in it, but the old Ghostbusters has what was called a demon dog, and it's scary, and so it looks very similar. I wonder if Hollywood used the posterior end of the saddleback caterpillar as kind of ideas for this, but very scary looking. And so if I'm a chickadee, I think I would back away from this one for sure.
And so there are other examples of moths that have utilized different types of chemical defenses, and here's a few of them. The interesting thing about the moths on this slide is that they, like the monarch butterfly, are milkweed specialists. And the monarch butterfly, of course, is bright orange, and you'll see tinges of orange on these creatures too. And that is it's a form of defense. In nature, bright orange and bright red are warning colorations. Aposematic defense is what the technical name is for it. So these particular moths, since their caterpillars are milkweed specialists, and milkweeds are toxic, the toxins in the milkweed that they eat are then, just like the monarch butterfly, passed along into the caterpillars and into the adult moths. And so since they, there's also a technical term for this, whereas all of these different milkweed specialists have evolved to have this same orange coloration, and they call that Mullerian mimicry. So anyway, these are pretty cool. The milkweed tussock moth is a favorite of mine. I always thought it looked like a little pipe cleaner, or like something that somebody would have tied up as a fishing lure or something like that.
It's good.
This is another example of chemical defense, and this is one that you're more to talk about, I think.
Yeah. I took some of these photos. This is the giant leopard moth. This is actually a pretty common moth that it was being reported quite a bit more recently, but it's dropped off. But it may come back. We sometimes see different broods. Very striking looking moth. And but if for a bird, so this moth can't really hide as an adult based on its patterning, but that black and white is a signal. And then also if it's attacked or approached, it will start to ooze this yellow kind of chemical that you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, which doesn't taste good to a bird. So it's a secondary. So essentially it's oozing a chemical defense that is going to hopefully make the bird spit it out, and then hopefully remember not to eat this colored moth again.
And then this slide is going to show us some other examples of caterpillars that have a combination of this, basically a chemical defense with a mechanical means of transporting it, and that mechanical means would be these spines. And so there's our saddleback caterpillar again that we looked at, the demon dog from a few slides ago. And that one, you know, it has these toxic chemicals that it can transport via its barbs to a person or other animal that touches it. And then the other caterpillars in this slide, the hickory tussock moth and the American dagger moth, although not as medically significant, are still ones that you don't want to touch because they do have stinging spines. And I don't know that we've ever found any examples, at least in North America, of adult moths that have any sort of medical significance to them. I don't believe there are they? So for the most part, most moths are harmless, but the ones on this page are kind of the exception to that rule.
Yeah, I don't know of any adult moths that are harmful, but there are several caterpillars that that could hurt us. So it's always a better idea just to look and not touch. Mm-hmm. The tails that you see on the Luna moth, there's not many moths that have these long tails. There are several butterflies that do, including the swallowtails. But these tails perform a mechanical defense. So one of the major predators of moths, flying moths, like adult moths, especially at night, are bats. And so moths are constantly trying to not be on the menu, whether it's for birds or bats or anything else. So the tail defense here is pretty interesting. When echolocation is going on by the bat, the echolocation essentially will kind of zero in that bat on the tails of this Luna moth and not the body. So the body's the most important part of a moth. It can't live without a portion of its body or all of it. So it has to protect that. So essentially the tails are to try to divert attention away from the body. And so it's not uncommon, if you are lucky enough to see a Luna moth, which do occur here in central Indiana, to see one without a tail. So that's essentially a moth that's probably survived an attack from a bat and lived another night.
I just grabbed my camera because I was outside just a little while ago, and I don't know if we can, hopefully this, it may not work.
It's a swallowtail.
Anyway, it's an eastern tiger swallowtail butterfly that's missing one of its tails that was still feeding from my Joe Pye weed. So the tail served its purpose in this case. The predator snapped onto a non-essential body part.
And for swallowtails, it works a little different. It's not echolocation so much as just sort of getting away, you know, and just the tails left. So it definitely helps. There's one caterpillar, there's one moth that we know of, I think.
Speaking of echolocation.
Yeah, this one actually uses echolocation itself to it can hear essentially the echolocation of a bat, and through an auditory device. And then when it picks up the echolocation of a predator, in this case a bat, it will kind of frantically dive down and fly in a very erratic pattern to hopefully avoid predation. And this caterpillar is the walnut sphinx. It's actually a pretty common, very commonly seen caterpillar, and well, maybe not caterpillar so much, but the moth itself. This caterpillar will whistle at you if it's alarmed. And so if you're a bird and you're creeping up on this caterpillar, hearing a whistle that comes out of its sphericals, which are those tiny little holes, white holes that you see on the side, could be just enough for the caterpillar to escape, which typically a caterpillar escapes not by running because they're not fast, but they will just drop to the ground and then hopefully hide.
And then we have mimicry defense. And there are some very interesting examples of this. So earlier when we looked at those caterpillars, the dagger moth caterpillar and the saddleback caterpillar that are using those barbs, those stingers, to dissuade predators. Some other caterpillars have appendages like this that make them look scary, but they're completely harmless. And this is an example of one. And this is really, I mean, it's a frightening, first of all, the head of this thing looks frightening. I think you described it as a Chinese dragon or something at one point, but also these little black barbs that are along the body look very similar to the stinging mechanisms that are used by some of those other caterpillars that we looked at. This is also an enormous caterpillar. This is like, what, about the size of a cigar, I guess. I would
7 inches, full grown, 7 inches. So about the size of a hot dog.
Yeah, right. So anyway, it's completely harmless, but it looks like something that would be scary. And scientists call this, when you have a harmless organism that looks like something that might be really scary, they call that Batesian mimicry. This is another example of it.
The sphinx moths, including that walnut sphinx that we saw. So it will whistle, but then also many of them, including this is the tobacco hornworm, or the caterpillar that eats our tomatoes, essentially. But it, if threatened, and many will do this, will rear up like a snake. And so this is also where they get the sphinx name, because the sphinx kind of cat reared up and sat that way. So this is really just try to scare a bird into thinking, that I'm not a caterpillar, I'm a larger snake. Very quickly, these caterpillars that you find in our gardens, for the most part, there are easy ways to manage them. There are other plants that they will eat. So with a little bit of research from our website, you can find out other places to move them. There is one caterpillar that will eat our tomatoes that's actually declining severely, and it doesn't get near the attention that monarchs and some other honeybees and other things get, and that's the five-spotted hawk moth. And it's one to keep an eye out for, and also a good example of why we just shouldn't kill anything that we see in our yards without doing some research.
And then many moths, particularly the silk moths, have this eye spot mimicry. And this is another form of Batesian mimicry, where you have a harmless organism that's pretending or to be a harmful organism. So we've got a couple of different silk moths here. On the left, the Polyphemus moth, and on the right, the Io moth. And when these moths, particularly the Io moth, are at rest, you don't see any form of eye spotting. The Polyphemus has a couple of small eye spots on the forewing. But if you look at the hind wings on both of these moths, they very much resemble large animal eyes. And so they have a couple of different defense mechanisms going on here. The first defense mechanism is crypsis. In other words, they're trying to camouflage themselves. So if you see that Io moth or the Polyphemus moth at rest when its forewings are retracted and covering the hind wings. It's trying to blend in with the leaves or with the tree bark. That's its number one strategy. However, if something were to come up and startle it, these moths will actually flash open their forewings to reveal those frightening eye spots, or they may be frightening enough, hopefully, and for the moth's sake, to be able to frighten away the predator just long enough where it can get away. So it flings its wings open. A bird that's there sees these eyes and it thinks maybe it's a mammal that it's disturbed, or perhaps a snake. More Batesian mimicry. And you can have this one.
So one of the other predators for caterpillars in particular are wasps, or these are parasitoid insects, and their life cycle is such that they will lay their eggs inside of a different host, and it would be a different, in this case, a different insect, and caterpillars are a favorite one of these. So it would be a terrible way to go. This is a Catalpa sphinx moth. It's actually looks like tiny little Q-tips on top of it. Those Q-tips are the pupa of this tiny wasp that's been kind of eating the caterpillar alive from the inside. And then when their life cycle's over, they kind of pop the hatch on this tiny Q-tip, and then they do their adult cycle at that point. So terrible way to go. Very common though, and you'll see this on the tomato hornworm that we mentioned, or tobacco hornworm in your garden as well. They get these parasitoids. So a wasp though that is looking, wait, what?
I was going to say it also illustrates the wasp's role in the ecosystem and helping to make sure that we don't have too many caterpillars.
Absolutely.
They're important as well.
Now, if the wasp is looking for a host, a caterpillar host to lay its eggs into, it is more likely to avoid a caterpillar that's already been preyed upon. So if another wasp, or many have already found and they have laid their eggs, and it wouldn't be a perfect host. So several caterpillars actually pretend with their own appendages and nubs and hairs and different things to look like they've already been preyed upon. So the Cecropia moth on the right, and then the white tussock mark on the left, both have these tufts and these nubs and nodules that are there to mimic what it would look like if a wasp sort of had already been preying upon it. It's a pretty ingenious way to do that. For the Cecropia moth caterpillar, by the way, if you've ever seen the movie A Bug's Life, that caterpillar in that movie was after the Cecropia moth, which is fun.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he's quite lovable.
And some moths will also mimic other insects. And so the organisms on this page are, believe it or not, both moths. The lesser peachtree borer moth on the left-hand side, it mimics a wasp. And so wasps, of course, have stingers, and most creatures would want to try to avoid those. And then the moth on the right is a strikingly beautiful moth called the painted lichen moth. And these are active right now. They are mimicking fireflies, and fireflies are said to be distasteful to birds. And so they're trying to pretend to be a beetle that's not very good to eat. And then some moths, there's actually a great deal of moths that mimic unpalatable food, in particular bird droppings or bird poop. And these are 4 different examples of moths that are considered to be bird poop mimics: the tufted bird dropping moth, Schlager's fruitworm moth, the bird dropping moth, and the beautiful wood nymph. And birds come along and they see one of these sitting on a leaf, and hopefully they'll keep going, thinking that it's not a meal, but something unpalatable.
A great photo as if somebody, and I have a lot of photos like this that I take that I think is a moth or a caterpillar, and it's actually bird poop. And so this is actually bird poop that our friend Doug took, but you can see how this is actually a moth that Steve just pulled up, and that looks strikingly similar to real bird poop. So it's an effective way to essentially hopefully hide from predators.
And then we have camouflage, and there are a few different strategies that moths will employ for camouflage. The first one would be during the larval stage, where a lot of different moth caterpillars will mimic twigs. And I guess there's a lot of them in the geometer family, right?
Yeah,
Which the
inchworms
geometer,
and
right? It was the Geometridae family, or the geometer moths, are colloquially known as the inchworms, and that's one of them on the left-hand side. And they are out trying to, if you think about it, these are foliage eating or phytophagous insects, which means foliage eating insects. And so they are spending their time on leaves, and in order to be able to avoid detection, they're trying to blend in as best as they can. In this case, they're trying to resemble the twigs of the leaves that they're eating on. The rose hook tip is another really cool one, although that's not a super good color for camouflage, but I walked past this thing a couple of times before realizing that it was actually a moth and not just a twig sitting on or a caterpillar, and not just a twig sitting on top of the leaf. And then we have caterpillars that are that mimic tree bark, and typically these are the moths that are living in the wooded areas, and such as all of the ones that you see in this photo here. And it's really, I think, quite amazing that they're able to know instinctively what they blend in with, and seek out those surfaces. And then we have moths that are leaf mimics, and the ones on this page specifically are mimicking dead or dried leaves. And these moths, several of these, I guess, or at least a couple of these, spend their life down in the leaf litter, their adult life, on the speckled wrenia, the maple loop moth. And so if you come across a pile of leaves and you see one of these moths in it, there's a good chance you might not see it, and you just keep going. But then we have moths that also mimic the green living leaves, like what we have right now. And some of these, the emeralds, there are a few moths in the, they're more of those geometer moths that are called emeralds based on their coloring. The red fringed emerald, and we have the blackberry looper and the badwing moth. And I just learned, I think, from you the last time we did this program, how the badwing moth got its name. I thought that was interesting, and maybe you want to share that.
Yeah, the badwing has its forewing is not, it's just longer and a little bit oddly shaped. And so entomologists, so those that study and have a doctorate in insects, they do a lot of pinning, like you might do for 4-H and some other things. And the badwing had a wing, the forewings would not pin, it wouldn't really rest right. Those wings would kind of flop. So entomologists from probably 100 years ago called it the badwing moth, because essentially the wings were bad to them because they wouldn't pin correctly.
They wouldn't cooperate.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a really interesting example of moth adaptation. So the red fringed emerald, Nemoria bistriaria, is a moth that has two separate distinct broods in Indiana and the Midwest. And the first brood is the one that we see over on the left-hand side. And that one, those emerge as adults in, I guess, late April-ish or maybe early May. And it's typically before the trees have leafed out. And so in this case, this first brood is trying to camouflage itself as either leaves from last year that are on the ground, or perhaps the bark of the tree that it might be sitting on. But then the incredible thing that happens is there's a second brood of these moths, which emerge in, I think, around this time of the year, if I'm not mistaken, right? Maybe late June or in July.
They're coming out now.
They're coming out now. And they're green, because this time of the year we have green leaves to blend in with. And it's just, to me, it's so incredibly amazing that that it's the same species looking completely different like that, to be able to use that as a defense mechanism for survival. And this moth, the wavy lime emerald, is camouflages itself both as a adult and as a caterpillar, but it does so in different ways. As an adult, it has that green leaf coloration like you see there. But as a caterpillar, I don't remember what the host plant is. It's a composite, right? An aster of some sort.
A lot of asters, yeah. And it's a pollen. I think it eats pollen and also the petals.
So what's going on here on the right-hand side of the screen, the right-hand photo, is that we have a caterpillar from that same moth, and those little orangish things that you see are the pieces of flower petals that it has adorned itself with to avoid detection while it's eating the pollen, right? So it's able to persist on a flower by looking like part of the flower.
Yeah, if you look at the center of a flower and you start to see it move in the middle, you're seeing a wavy lined emerald.
And then, other surfaces, I'll let you talk about this one because those are all your photos, I think.
Yeah, there are other surfaces. I'm always surprised at even man-made surfaces. This is concrete on the far left that a caterpillar or a butterfly, sorry, it was a moth, flew onto and then practically disappeared. I saw it land and it took me forever to find it. We have the wall here at the Cool Creek Nature Center tends to get a lot of gray colored moths that hide on it in plain sight sometimes. And then our maintenance facility in the park has a cobblestone or kind of a rocky wall, prefab wall. And there's moths that hide on that seem to know that they're not easily seen on that wall as well.
And again, the amazing adaptation here is that these animals don't have eyes that enable them to see the backside of it, and yet they know what surface they will blend in with.
They're more self-aware than some of my friends, honestly. So amazing.
And then there's bedazzlement, and this is one that scientists really haven't completely figured out yet. And we have some of these caterpillars that are an adult moth, in this case, the giant leopard moth, but the hooded owlet moth, the Turbian phosphyla, these are not caterpillars that you're going to easily walk past and not see. They're typically sitting there right there on a green leaf, and they're wearing their bright, black and white or yellow, orange, blue, and red coloration. And so, what would be the adaptation for that? And the best that scientists have been able to figure out with those is that they're looking so outlandishly bright and apparent that that maybe a predator would look at it and think twice about eating something like that, because it's clearly not trying to hide. You compared it to the zebra, I think.
Yeah, the zebra is more disruptive patterning as well. So there's some thought on that's somewhat disruptive.
And where can we go to find moths? Moths are like they're like goldenrods or asters, which I like to think of as being plants that have members in just about every ecosystem, and that's very much true for moths. And so we have moths that exist in the prairies and in our grasslands. Some of these things you may have in your own home landscape. These grass veneers down on the bottom are a group of moths that are very small, and when they're sitting, gosh, I don't know, how large would you describe those? They're probably maybe only
like a long grain of rice, maybe.
Yeah, a little bit larger than a grain of rice, but not much. They're pretty.
I'd say like the longer grain that you might get, grain rice.
Yep, and some of them they're larval specialists on grasses, and so they've adapted to human lawns. The hummingbird clearwing moth is the diurnal moth, and we'll see that in prairies, nectaring from a lot of the prairie plants right about this time of year. And then the wooded moths, and if you look at the contrasting colors between the last set of moths and the woodland moths, these are clearly moths that live in the woodlands because they all are looking like tree bark or tree leaves or something like that. So the tulip tree beauty is really a big, large moth with very intricate patterning to it. But it does a good job of blending in a woodland landscape. And these are some moths that are found in wetland areas. The Licans haploa, which is a moth that people typically get excited when they see because it's so strikingly colored. And a lot of folks think that they see a butterfly. That's one of the moths that is a diurnal moth. So we'll get those during the daytime. And I guess Nessus sphinx too, right? Those are also diurnal, or are they both?
I've seen them both, but
yeah.
I think more in the day.
It does seem like these wetland moths typically can be more diurnal maybe than some of the other ones are. Maybe that's anecdotal observation perhaps on my part. And there are moths that are purely aquatic. And I think it was the, which one was it? The top right one, I think the two banded Petrophylla that I took the photo of at St. Pat's County Park up here in St. Joe County. I was doing taping a TV show segment, and had a moth sheet set up. And here comes this moth that I'd never seen before, and I wasn't able to identify it right away. So I took some photos of it and identified it later. And come to find, its larvae are purely aquatic, and so they live in the water. And here I was, basically on the bank of the St. Joseph River, which explains why I never had them in my home landscape, because I don't have a river next to me. So. But yeah, pretty amazing. And then we have, suburban urban moths. And there are moths like, if you think of things like the American robin, whose populations have probably benefited from landscapes like this, there are a few moths that have as well. These are some common moths that we may see in our own backyards. The chickweed geometer, it's a host plant like chickweed, which is lawn weed. And as such, you'll typically get these in your home landscape. The common idea is, why did we include this one in here? Do you remember the host plant on that one? I can't recall either. But
gotta
the one
be something
on the
common.
Yeah, and the one on the right, the Isabella tiger moth, most folks would know that better from its caterpillar form, which is the woolly bear caterpillar. That some people say can predict the severity of winters. We'll see those in the fall, and we should have put an image on there, but I think probably a lot of people know what they look like. So you can have this one.
There are agricultural pests too. Many of these have come in from the agricultural trade. So although the tobacco hornworm has not, it's a native, but the other three are non-native species that come in, whether it's trade goods, landscape plants. The gypsy moth is especially bad up north, northern Indiana into Michigan, and it can really defoliate trees and cause some damage for that type of thing. So, but yeah, we have definitely some agricultural pests. So the European corn borer would be one that you'd see if you live near a farm field.
And I do, and that was in my kitchen window.
The Indian meal moth is one that, unfortunately, if you've ever opened some grains and seen little bugs inside of it, or moths up in your cupboards and corners of your kitchen, that's a moth that can actually cause some problems from some of our grains and stored goods. So.
And that's an introduced moth, I want to say, from South America.
Mm-hmm.
Moth. Why it has the word Indian in it, but so where to find moths? Look for their host plants. Host plants are very important for moths, and by host plants we mean the plant that is usable as food by the caterpillar, by the larvae. And these Io moths, that's your photo, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. So this is a young ash tree that was out in the prairie here at the Nature Center, but a young ash tree. So and a bunch of them together. So in many cases, if you know what the moth eats, which sometimes this can be a variety of things, in the case of the Io, but look for leaves that have chewed up edges or middles. That's a pretty good indication that an insect's been there or is there now. A lot of these caterpillars are more commonly eating at night than they are during the day, trying to hide from birds during the day, but keep an eye out for them. And then once adults hatch, for the most part, most of our moths don't leave too far away from where they were where they hatched as a larva and then pupa. So in cocoons and things. So within maybe about a mile is where you'll find most of them. So if you have good diversity, you'll have a lot of things. I know we're running short on time, so we'll run through this, but the Cecropia moth I mentioned before is on the left-hand side, and there's a little cartoon here that indicates he likes to eat all kinds of plants. I think he eats 60 or more different genre of plants. And he's talking to our milkweed specialist who says that he's really picky. He only eats one genus of plant, which is milkweed. And the Cecropia answers back. He says, "What? That's like one of the few things I can't eat. That stuff's poisonous." But our specialist, the milkweed tussock moth, indicates he's been building up immunities to the toxins for years, and can one of the few insects really that can enjoy milkweed as a food. But in this case, one food. It really doesn't have it doesn't have any other options for the most part of what it can eat. Whereas the Cecropia can eat a lot of different things, but not milkweed.
This actually puts some of the extreme specialists more at risk. So the benefit of the specialists in many cases is that they're eating these toxic plants and the toxins are being passed on to them. And so there's a benefit to the specialists, but the downside is that they become reliant on a very narrow range of food. And so this was a slide that we put together on the Bombicoidea moths, which is the superfamily that contains the silk moths and the sphinx moths. And over on the left-hand side, we have the least at-risk species, which are the more generalistic moths, including the Cecropia that we just looked at. And then as we move from the left to the right-hand side of the screen, we become more and more specialized. So, halfway through, we've got, here's our Cecropia moth with 74 different genre of plants that it can eat. And we had on our webpage, we listed them all. And so it's just really pages and pages of different host plants that are available for this moth. So it's, if we have some sort of catastrophe that happens, like what happened with the elm trees or with the ash trees, or we start losing them, there are a number of different things that the Cecropia moth can eat. This is kind of midway through that page, the imperial moth. Now we're down to 26 different genre of plants that it can eat. As we get more specialized, the laurel sphinx moth is down to 13 different species, or 13 different genre, of plants. And then as an extreme specialist, we have this moth, which is the Titan sphinx, and it's only able to eat from one genus of moths, and that is in Indiana, we have only one species in that genus, which is buttonbush, which is a native shrub that's flowering right now, at least up here in northern Indiana.
Here too, almost done.
And how can we help moths? We can add native plants to our landscape. That's a big one. Don't garden with exotic plants, because most of the exotic plants that we go to big box stores or garden centers and we put into our landscapes are completely unusable to butterflies and moths. Even though some things may attract them as adults as nectar, they need to have these specialized host plants to be able to survive as caterpillars. These are just a couple of slides of my own house and some little areas of landscape that I've put in with native plants that will support insects and pollinate different types of pollinators. This is the first slide is my walkway that as it may appear in May. And then we transition into kind of what it looks like right now with a succession of blooms, and it's full of different butterflies and other pollinating insects. And native trees are super, super important, probably more important than doing things like the perennial plants, because these are the things that are really supporting the biodiversity of life, starting with oak trees as being the number one tree with over 500 different species of butterflies and moths documented as eating the foliage of oak trees. Followed by oaks. The second one is the genus Prunus, which includes cherries and plums. And again, we're still around 450 different species that this will support. And then we contrast that to a very common, unfortunate landscape plant, the Calorie pear or Bradford pear. Or this is what, Carmel, that you took this picture?
This is sort of an intersection between Westfield and Noblesville, just north of Carmel on the way to Carmel. This is Hazeldale Parkway that a lot of people might recognize. It's pretty much where those three cities meet, and just lined with Bradford pears. So I think I counted one time over 350 of them. So these trees, not only do they smell, and they're not really providing a lot of nectar for anything when they bloom in late March and April, but their leaves are not providing any food. So if you're a chickadee living in this area, as our example, going back to, you can't find any caterpillars in these trees, or if you can, it's maybe one or two species, but some people think there's none that eat them. So
we have them listed as 0 to 2 because researchers have located 2 caterpillars on the leaves, but there was no clear-cut evidence that they were actually eating the leaves. They might be, but it might be, they may not be either. But even if they are, there's not enough to support life from these trees. And they've escaped cultivation and become invasive. And so there's other reasons not to plant these. So if you have these, now is a good time to get rid of them. And in this fall, replace it with a native tree. Butterfly bush is a popular one in the nursery trade, also the Buddleia genus. And this is one that will attract pollinating insects and butterflies late in the summer. However, it doesn't have the capability of supporting the caterpillars. So it's unusable to the caterpillars. The butterflies will not lay their eggs on this plant. Moths will not lay their eggs on this plant, and they can't eat it. This is another table of supported genre. We'll blow past this pretty quickly. But again, the oaks, willows, cherries, birches, all of our native trees, the cottonwoods, crab apples, elms, these are the ones that are supporting life. And then also leaf litter in the fall, right? We have a war on leaves every October, where as soon as the leaves fall, we think we have to rake them up and dispose of them. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of these caterpillars, or excuse me, pupa, right? Talk to me. Talk about this, Amanda.
All moths and butterflies in the Lepidoptera order all go through 4 stages of their life cycle, and the pupa is the same for moths and butterflies. Butterfly pupa are typically called chrysalis. Moth pupa are typically called cocoons, and different moths have different types of cocoons. Some actually don't cocoon at all; they just kind of get a hard pupa. And others make kind of a furry looking or fuzzy looking cocoon.
But they spend their winter months, a lot of them do, in the leaf litter, right? That's
yes. For the most part, some will hang on twigs and things, but I would say a majority of them actually fall to the ground, or they pupate actually in the leaf litter, or just under the surface of the dirt, or right in that surface dirt. Under the leaves. And so that's where they are. So when we're raking and bagging and burning potentially leaves, we're raking up a huge diversity of different insects, not just moth and butterflies, but a lot of moth and butterflies.
And this is a couple of examples. The morning cloak butterfly is usually the first butterfly is the first one that people see in the spring, because they actually overwinter in that leaf litter as adults. Does the discolored rhenia as well?
No, I don't think so. I think that it I don't believe so, though.
Okay. You want to talk about this?
Yes. So another thing that we can do is, when possible, try to not, when you're planting, also try to find plants that are straight species as opposed to cultivars. And this is another kind of challenge in knowing what to find and what to buy. But in many cases, like the double-headed coneflower that you see, the purple coneflower there in the middle, this is, for some, they look at this and this is a more attractive species to them and be one to put in their yard. But for butterflies, especially pollinators, this is true for bees and other things too, they actually can't, the flower is not functional for them in that they can't pollinate it. Several times, if you look at certain kinds of maple trees, though, the darker shades, those red kind of maroon trees, those trees, unfortunately, are not normally eaten by caterpillars because they have a lot of anthocyanin in them, which is a protein and an enzyme, I think, actually, that has been cultivated because some people like that red look, but the caterpillars don't like that red look because it's too much anthocyanin. So these types of things can be helpful. Plus, a lot of times these have been treated more aggressively with neonicotinoids and other pesticides that can harm them.
That was a perfect segue to the next slide. But you just covered it.
Oh yeah.
Neonicotinoids.
Yes.
And so, you know, in the garden trade forever, right? I mean, the mantra has been, if you've got something that's chewing on your leaves, it's a bad thing and you need to spray it or dust for it or whatever. And then that advanced into these neonicotinoids, which can be systemic insecticides that are applied to these plants. So it essentially makes them toxic to just about anything that wants to eat it, which is a terrible thing.
And for those that may get a lawn service, it's not necessarily all bad, but in some cases, if you're not looking at some of the treatments that they're doing, and in some cases they are systemically, essentially kind of injecting your trees and shrubs with a poison to kill things that they think that you don't want holes in your leaves. So take a look at that. That's something easily that you could stop or not start, ideally. And then mosquito spraying is becoming more and more concerning. I think, especially as we're seeing more private homeowners doing these kind of foliage sprays where they're coming in to kill adult mosquitoes. There's not a targeted way in this with a spray to really hit just mosquitoes. So any of these outfits that come in and treat a yard, it's not just killing mosquitoes, it's killing moths, lightning bugs, all kinds of different beneficial insects within that space. And this particular type of foliage spray supposedly is good for 2 weeks. So to repel. So we're actually essentially blocking off huge sections of land from these insects. So there are more effective ways to treat mosquitoes than this, and many of it's a lot cheaper too. And we can go into a whole nother program on that, but some of the simple ways is look for where they breed. That's where you're going to pinpoint mosquitoes the most. So look for standing water, gutters, baby pools, tires, watering cans. I mean, a watering can that's left out for over a week full of water could be breeding 2,000 mosquitoes. And then personally, putting bug spray on us or wearing a thermocell or even just using a fan when you're out in the patio if you're having dinner. Mosquitoes are not strong flyers. So any kind of wind and a fan will eventually or actually just kind of make it difficult for them to fly. This question, why are moths attracted to light? We'll go to the next slide. We really don't know. It's a mystery. There are several different theories on it, but it's not really known. Attracting.
I thought we had more stuff there, but yeah.
No, I took it out.
Okay.
Yeah. Different theories include navigation, finding mates, and then also that the light sort of replicates food. But all three of those have major flaws in them. And so it's still a mystery. Really, scientists don't know why moths are attracted to light. But we know that many are, some are not. Some are not attracted to light at all. But those that are make it a little bit easier. So this is my porch light on the right-hand side. And just simply leaving a porch light on, even for a portion of the night, can attract moths. And nowadays with the cell phone in our hand or pocket, it's very easy to possibly click a photo of these and learn more about them. There are many apps and books. This is a light that I did too, and then a black light down on the other end. This is kind of a really low key way of doing it, but Steve's setup's a lot fancier looking.
It's a fun family project too. If you have kids that are bored during the summer and they want to stay up all night and sleep till noon, and you know, you can set up a moth sheet, put a couple of lights on there, maybe go out every 15, 20, 30 minutes and check and see what's on there. And they do change over the course of the evening, it seems. Some people use food to bait the moths. Some of them will come to these concoctions that typically consist of some rotting fruit and beer for whatever reason. And then, you know, photographing them. If you've got a cell phone, you can photograph moths. And some of these accessory kits for cell phones now are very trick with what they're able to do with doing macro photography and things like the one.
They're not expensive generally either. The kit that I have, which is pictured down on the right, only about $20, you know, without shipping.
This is another picture of my setup, and I use a digital SLR with a macro lens on a tripod, and I'm able to get some pretty decent shots that way. And then further research, the field guides, the two of them that are the most common are the Peterson Guide to Moths, Caterpillars of Eastern North America for caterpillars. And then there's a few good websites out there. Bugguide.net is a well-known one. Butterflies and Moths of North America is another one where you can do some citizen science, like with our website, submit sightings. The Moth Photography Group, which is run by Mississippi State, has a lot of different pin specimens on there. A lot of people use iNaturalist. LepSnap is an app that is also out there. I'll let you end on this one.
Our website, we hope, especially those in Indiana, use. This is an Indiana specific look at moths that we have found in our state. And we don't have pages for everything, 134 evidently moth species pages, but the GAINLP, that citizen science kind of initiative through our Facebook group primarily, has found different individuals through the state now have found 1,817 different species of moth and or butterfly in the state of Indiana. So we're hoping that maybe we can get to over 2,000, which I think Purdue estimates that 2,200 species of butterfly and moth can be found in Indiana. And every day we learn a little more. We have lots of platforms that you can find us at Indiana nature.net, and then as mentioned, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, all of that. And Mindy, I was hoping to get an email from the person in the chat, but I haven't seen it yet. So I will keep looking for that, because there was a moth that they wanted to send for me to identify. And I've looked at the email, but I don't see it yet. So to that person, when I get that,
they can always reach out to me and send it my way. My mom is sending it now.
Oh, I see it. Yeah.
I mean, they should have and if I can't identify it, I will happily pass it on, and we'll get it added to the GAINLP.
Yeah, that would be great. And that's always a permission based. So if people can ask for identification help through us, and we're happy to provide it, and that's it. But if you want to be involved, we always want to ask for permission. And then hopefully you saw several people's photos that we use. We always use, if we use it outside of, on the website, and then outside of it, always has credit to the artist that took the photo. So.
Well, before everyone heads out, if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop it into the chat, or you can raise your hand and I'm happy to promote you if you'd rather ask in person. So we'll give a couple minutes to see if anyone's interested, and then otherwise we'll stop the recording and call it a night. So everyone's quiet. You guys did a great job.
Thank you.
A lot of information.
Yeah, it is.
Good,
101.
Good evening to go out and look for them also.
There you go.
It's kind of calm. At least it is here. It's kind of calm, kind of muggy. And this is really, right now, we're pretty much at the peak of the moth season.
Yeah, National Moth Week, which is why the Zionsville team had us on. So
It just worked out perfect, didn't it?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, we're excited, and the group is there too. If anyone is interested in learning more just about nature in general, we do have a lot of moth posts, but we're certainly open for all kinds of different questions, and trees to snakes and mushrooms and everything. So hopefully it's a one-stop place to possibly get questions answered.
Awesome. Sounds good. Well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions, so I'm going to stop the recording